The cold did not come from the ancient stones of the chapel. It came from the gold ring now being pushed onto her finger. It felt heavy, a manacle disguised as a jewel. Eleanor Vance kept her hand perfectly still, a marble statue in a dress of ivory silk. The material was a cage of its own, stiff and unforgiving against her skin. She could feel the weight of hundreds of pairs of eyes, all focused on this union, this merging of a fallen house with the one that had orchestrated its demise. Her gaze remained fixed on the altar, on the flickering candle flame that danced as if struggling for air in the cavernous space. The priest's voice was a low drone, a meaningless river of words that flowed over her without leaving a trace. He spoke of devotion, of fidelity, of two becoming one. To Eleanor, it was the language of a transaction, a soul for a key, a life for a chance at justice. Beside her, Duke Alistair Blackwood stood tall and unmoving, a figure carved from granite and arrogance. She had not looked at his face since she met him at the altar, but she could feel the cold authority radiating from him. He smelled of expensive leather and winter air. He was the son of the man who had destroyed her father. Now he was her husband. "I now pronounce you man and wife." The words echoed, final and absolute. A muffled, polite ripple of applause went through the pews. It sounded like the patter of distant rain on a tomb. Alistair turned to her. His eyes, a piercing and brilliant blue, met hers. There was no warmth in them, only a cool, possessive assessment. He was looking at a prize he had been forced to claim, a piece of a ruined estate absorbed into his own. He saw a name, a lineage, a problem now contained. He did not see the woman whose heart was a fist of ice, whose mind was a razor-sharp ledger of debts to be paid. Her own eyes, a sorrowful gray that held the memory of too many tears, did not waver. She had practiced this composure for months in front of a cracked mirror in her family's now modest townhouse. She had practiced holding the gaze of a predator. Alistair's hand, cool and firm, took her elbow. The touch was impersonal, a duty performed. He guided her back down the aisle, away from the altar and into her new life, into the lion's den. As they walked, the faces of the guests blurred into a tapestry of muted colors and curious expressions. She saw whispers exchanged behind gloved hands, faint smiles that did not reach the eyes. They were the aristocracy, a flock of beautifully plumed birds pecking at the carcass of a lesser creature. They saw the daughter of Lord Julian Vance, the supposed traitor, the man who had lost everything. They saw her shame, her family's disgrace, now being polished over with the luster of the Blackwood name. They thought this was her salvation. Eleanor knew it was her declaration of war. Her father's face swam in her memory. Not the broken man from the end, but the father of her youth. The one who taught her constellations and quoted ancient philosophers. The one whose hands, smelling of old paper and ink, would rest on her shoulder as he explained the intricate beauty of a balanced account book. "Truth is in the details, Eleanor," he used to say. "Numbers do not lie, but the men who write them often do." He had trusted Duke Theron Blackwood. He had called him a friend, a brother in commerce, and that trust had been his undoing. It had cost him his fortune, his honor, and ultimately, his life. Eleanor's fingers curled slightly within the confines of her own hand. No, numbers do not lie. And somewhere in the heart of the Blackwood estate, the numbers that would prove his innocence were waiting. She would find them. This marriage was the price of admission. They emerged from the chapel's gloom into the pale, watery light of a late autumn afternoon. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Blackwood Manor loomed at the end of the long gravel drive, its Gothic spires and dark stone walls seeming to swallow the very light from the sky. It was not a home. It was a fortress, a monument to a legacy built on secrets, her new cage, her hunting ground. The wedding feast was held in the grand ballroom, a hall so vast it could have housed her entire childhood home with a room to spare. Crystal chandeliers, each one a galaxy of glittering teardrops, hung from the impossibly high frescoed ceiling. Portraits of past Blackwoods stared down from the walls, their painted eyes cold and judgmental. Eleanor felt the gaze of one in particular, hung in the place of honor above the massive fireplace. Duke Theron Blackwood, Alistair's father. His portrait was the largest, the most imposing. He had a stern face, a mouth set in a line of ruthless calculation, and eyes that held no light at all. Looking at him was like looking into a well. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty hall. It was you, she thought, her voice a silent scream in the hollow of her mind. It was always you. She was seated at the head table, a queen on a throne of ice, next to her new king. The table was laden with a feast fit for royalty. Roast swan, glistening meats, towers of glazed fruits, and pastries so delicate they looked as though they might shatter if you breathe on them. The scent was overwhelming, a cloying mix of spices and sugar. Eleanor picked up her silver fork, the weight of it familiar and yet alien in this setting. She moved a single garden pea around her plate, the perfect picture of a demure, overwhelmed bride. Her stomach was a tight knot of nerves and resolve. She could not eat. Every bite would feel like a betrayal. Alistair ate with a practiced, almost bored efficiency. He spoke little, offering only curt nods to the guests who dared approach the head table to offer their congratulations. He was a man accustomed to being the center of any room, yet he seemed entirely contained within himself, a world of his own. He drank his wine, his gaze sweeping over the crowd with an air of detached ownership. He owned this hall, this land, these people, and now he owned her. The thought sent a fresh wave of cold fury through her veins, but her expression remained serene. Patience, she told herself. Patience is a weapon the arrogant never see coming. Her maid Anna stood by the far wall, her plain face a mask of neutrality. But Eleanor knew that behind those watchful eyes, Anna was absorbing everything. Anna was the only person in the world who knew the truth. She was the only one who knew that Eleanor's wedding trousseau contained not just silk and lace, but a small, worn leather journal filled with her father's elegant script. Anna was her confidant, her ally, her only tether to the person she used to be. Their eyes met for a fleeting second across the cavernous room, a silent exchange of solidarity. It was enough. Hours bled into one another. Speeches were made praising the glorious union of two great houses. The words were empty, polished stones dropped into a deep well. Eleanor smiled when she was supposed to smile, a slight, sad curve of her lips. She inclined her head graciously. She played her part. She was the Duchess Eleanor Blackwood, a beautiful, tragic figure given a second chance. She let them think it. She let them believe she was fragile, broken, grateful. It was the perfect camouflage. The orchestra began to play a waltz, its melody sweeping and romantic. It was a sound that belonged to another world, a world of genuine joy and celebration. Here it was just noise, a soundtrack to a silent, brutal play. Several couples moved to the dance floor, their rich fabrics whispering across the polished marble. Alistair made no move to ask her to dance. He simply sat there, nursing another glass of deep red wine, his jaw set. It was a relief. The idea of being held in his arms, of having to pretend for even one moment that this was anything but a strategic maneuver, was nauseating. Then he turned to her. The movement was sudden, breaking the stillness he had maintained for the better part of an hour. The low hum of conversation and music swelling seemed to fade into the background. All Eleanor could feel was the intensity of his focus. His blue eyes, which had been scanning the room with disinterest, were now fixed entirely on her. They were like chips of ice, yet she could see a flicker of something deeper within them, something cold and hard. He leaned in close, his body shifting to block her from the view of the rest of the room. The gesture was intimate, proprietary. His breath was warm against her ear, smelling faintly of wine. For a terrifying second, her heart leaped into her throat. She thought he might say something personal, something to break the fragile truce of their silence. A question, a comment, anything. What he said was far worse and far more welcome. His voice was a low, menacing whisper, meant for her alone. Do not for a moment forget your place. The words slid into her ear like slivers of glass. Her entire body went rigid. This was it, the first move in the game. You are in my house now, he continued, his tone devoid of any emotion but cold command. You bear my name. But advance is advance. I will be watching every move you make. There it was, the threat she had been waiting for, the declaration that she was a prisoner, a suspect under constant surveillance. He expected her to flinch. He expected fear, tears, a trembling submission. He expected the daughter of a ruined man to crumble under the weight of his power. He thought he was setting the terms of her surrender on their wedding day. Eleanor did not pull away. She did not tremble. Instead, a strange, quiet calm settled over her. The knot of anxiety in her stomach dissolved, replaced by a core of pure, unyielding steel. She had spent 5 years living with the ghost of her father's shame. She had watched her mother wither from grief. She had endured the pity and scorn of a world that had once admired her. A whispered threat from a man she despised was nothing. It was a gift. It confirmed that he saw her as an enemy. It meant the battle was joined. She took a deliberate, measured breath. She could feel the warmth of his proximity, the rough texture of his tailored jacket against the air beside her cheek. She let the silence stretch for a heartbeat, 2 heartbeats. She wanted him to feel the weight of her stillness. Then she turned her head slowly until her face was just inches from his. She did not look at his mouth or his jaw. She looked directly into his piercing blue eyes, holding his gaze without a flicker of fear. Her own voice, when she spoke, was not a whisper. It was quiet, clear, and perfectly steady. It carried the chilling grace of a falling snowflake, beautiful and deadly. "And as I will be watching you, your grace." She used his title as both a shield and a sword. It acknowledged his station while simultaneously creating a formal, unbridgeable chasm between them. It was not the response of a frightened bride. It was the response of an equal, a combatant. Alistair's expression for the first time that day changed. The arrogant confidence in his eyes faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine surprise. His brows drew together slightly. He had expected a mouse, and he had found something with teeth. He stared at her, the music and chatter of the ballroom fading into a dull, distant roar. The space between them crackled with a new and dangerous energy. He had thrown down a gauntlet, expecting her to kneel. Instead, she had picked it up and thrown it right back. He did not reply. He simply held her gaze, his blue eyes searching hers for a sign of weakness, for a crack in her composure. He found none. He saw only the reflection of his own surprise in the cool gray depths of her eyes. The opulent hall, the celebrating guests, the grand feast, it all disappeared. There were only 2 people in that moment, a duke who had just realized his new duchess was not what he thought, and a woman who had just fired the first shot in a war to reclaim her father's name. The silent battle for power between them had officially begun. The silence that fell after her words was heavier than any wedding vow. Alistair simply stared at her, his piercing blue eyes stripped of their earlier arrogance. For a moment, he looked like a man who had been struck, not by a hand, but by a ghost. The murmurs of the remaining guests faded into a distant hum. The grand hall, with its towering ceilings and tapestries of blackwood victories, suddenly felt small and airless. He had expected fear, perhaps even tears. He had not expected a declaration of war, delivered with the serene calm of a queen. Without another word, he turned. The rigid line of his back was a dismissal and an order all in one. He did not offer her his arm. He simply started walking, expecting her to follow. Eleanor rose, her silk gown whispering against the stone floor. She followed him like a shadow, her posture erect, her gaze fixed straight ahead. They moved through the emptying halls of Blackwood Manor, a silent procession of 2. The laughter and music of the feast died behind them, replaced by the cold echo of their footsteps on marble. Portraits of past Blackwoods watched them pass, stern men and severe women, their painted eyes seeming to follow Eleanor with suspicion. She met their gazes without flinching. She felt a specific chill as they passed a particularly large portrait of the previous Duke, Theron Blackwood, Alistair's father. His face was a mask of shrewd ambition, his eyes holding the same cold fire she now saw in his son. He was the architect of her family's ruin, the man whose name was a curse in her heart. She held his painted gaze until they turned a corner. The image of him burned into her mind. Alistair led her up a grand, sweeping staircase, the dark wood of the banister cool beneath her gloved hand. The air grew colder here, away from the fires of the great hall. It smelled of beeswax and old paper, the scent of a house that held more history than warmth. They walked down a long, carpeted corridor, lined with closed doors. At the very end of the wing, he stopped before a tall mahogany door. He turned the polished brass handle and pushed it open, revealing a large, impeccably furnished bedchamber. A fire was already lit in the hearth, casting a warm glow on the deep blue fabrics and dark polished furniture. It was a room of immense luxury and profound loneliness. "This will be your chamber," Alistair stated. His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. He did not look at her. He looked into the room, as if assessing its contents. He then took 2 steps back into the hall and gestured vaguely down the corridor they had just walked. "My own rooms are in the East Wing," he said. The statement hung in the air between them, a final, clear definition of their union. This was not a marriage of passion or partnership. It was a transaction, and their sleeping arrangements were merely the final clause in the contract. He had brought her to her gilded cage and was now leaving her in it. Eleanor inclined her head slightly. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, her voice perfectly even. She gave him nothing, no disappointment, no anger, no satisfaction, just a quiet, formal acceptance. For a second time that night, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. It was as if her composure was a constant, low-level irritant he could not soothe. He gave a curt nod, turned on his heel, and walked away. His footsteps receded down the hall until they were swallowed by the immense silence of the house. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a long moment, listening to the quiet. Then she stepped inside and closed the heavy door behind her, the click of the latch sounding unnervingly final. Her lady's maid, Anna, was waiting for her, standing quietly by the fireplace. Anna's plain, loyal face was the only piece of her old life Eleanor had been allowed to bring with her. The sight of her was a small, steadying comfort. "Your Grace," Anna murmured, curtsying. Eleanor let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. "Just Eleanor, Anna, at least when we are alone." She moved toward the center of the room, her fingers unfastening the suffocating pearl necklace at her throat. "Has everything been brought up?" "Yes, my lady," Anna replied, helping her with the intricate clasps of her wedding gown. "Your trunks are in the dressing room." Eleanor nodded, stepping out of the heavy silk dress. Anna wrapped a simple dressing gown of dark velvet around her shoulders. The warmth of the fabric was a small mercy. The room was beautiful, a perfect picture of aristocratic comfort. A massive 4-poster bed was draped in navy silk, and a delicate writing desk stood by the window, overlooking the darkened grounds. But it felt sterile, a guest room designed to impress, not to be lived in. There was nothing of her in it. Once Anna had seen to the gown and made sure Eleanor needed nothing else, she quietly excused herself for the night. Eleanor was finally truly alone. She walked not to the bed, but to a small, battered leather trunk tucked away in the dressing room. It held the few possessions she had brought from the shell of her former home. Most were simple clothes, but hidden beneath a layer of wool shawls was her only real treasure. She lifted it out with careful hands. It was a small, worn journal bound in dark brown leather with a tarnished silver clasp. The pages were filled with the elegant, looping script of her father, Lord Julian Vance. This book was her Bible, her mission statement, the last piece of her father's true soul she had left. She carried it back to the armchair by the fire and sat down, the book resting in her lap like a sleeping bird. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the clasp. The scent of old paper and dried ink rose to meet her, a fragrance more familiar and comforting than any perfume. She didn't need to search for the passage. She knew it by heart. Her eyes found the date from 5 years ago, just months before everything fell apart. "Alistair's father, Theron, paid a visit today," her father had written. "He has a mind like a steel trap, a true titan of industry. Yet when we speak of our joint ventures, there is an easy trust between us that I value more than any profit." He spoke of his son, young Alistair, and his great hopes for the boy's future. Theron believes loyalty is the bedrock upon which all great families are built. I find I must agree with him. To have such a friend and partner is a rare blessing in this world. A single hot tear escaped her eye and fell onto the page, blurring the ink. She quickly wiped it away, her grief instantly hardening into a cold, sharp resolve. A rare blessing. Her father had called that monster a blessing. He had trusted Theron Blackwood completely, and that trust had been his undoing. Theron had used it as a weapon, twisting their shared finances, falsifying records, and framing Lord Vance for his own crimes. He had systematically dismantled his friend's fortune and reputation, all while smiling and speaking of loyalty. Eleanor closed the journal, her knuckles white as she gripped it. The warmth from the fireplace did not reach the chill that had settled deep in her bones. This house was built on lies. The Blackwood name, so proud and powerful, was gilded with the honor of a man it had destroyed. Her father. She was here for one reason and one reason only: to find the proof of that betrayal hidden somewhere within these cold stone walls. She would find the ledgers, the letters, the documents that would expose Theron Blackwood for the thief he was. And his son, the arrogant duke who now wore his father's title and power, would watch as she tore it all down. His threat at the feast was meaningless. He was guarding a fortress he did not know was already rotten from the inside. She was not a prisoner in his home. She was a saboteur. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the pale gray light of dawn filtering through the heavy curtains. She had not slept well, her mind a whirlwind of strategy and sorrow. She dressed with Anna's help in a simple but elegant day dress of dark gray wool. It was a color of mourning, but also of stone, unbreakable. She wore her auburn hair pulled back in a severe, tight chignon. There would be nothing soft about her. After a solitary breakfast served in a small, cheerless dining room, she began her campaign. She would not ask for a tour. That would seem too eager, too suspicious. Instead, she would simply explore, as any new lady of the house might be expected to do. She began on the ground floor, her steps measured and quiet. She let her fingers trail along the surfaces of tables and the backs of chairs, her expression one of mild, polite curiosity. But her eyes missed nothing. She was cataloging the geography of her battlefield. She noted the location of the main reception rooms, the ballroom, the morning room. She paid special attention to the staff, their movements, and their routines. Who carried keys? Which doors were kept locked? She walked with the grace and poise of a duchess, but she thought with the cold precision of a general surveying enemy land. The house was a labyrinth of corridors and wings, each more imposing than the last. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the tall, narrow windows, leaving many of the halls in a state of perpetual twilight. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant chime of a clock or the whisper of a servant's shoes on a faraway floor. It was a house that seemed to be holding its breath, jealously guarding its secrets. She found the main library by following the faint scent of old leather. It was a breathtaking room, 2 stories high, with floor-to-ceiling shelves of dark, gleaming wood. A rolling ladder rested against one wall, promising access to thousands of volumes. Light streamed in from a set of arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. This, she knew, would be the heart of her search. The ledgers and records she needed would almost certainly be here or in a study connected to it. But the doors were closed, locked. She did not try the handle. She simply stood before it for a moment, committing its position to memory. She felt a deep, ancestral pull towards the room. Her father had been a scholar. He would have loved a library like this. The thought sent a sharp pang of loss through her, but she pushed it down. Grief was a luxury she could not afford. Not yet. She continued her slow, deliberate circuit of the ground floor, eventually finding her way to the West Wing, which seemed to house the administrative offices of the estate. Here, the carpets were more worn, the air smelling of ink and busy work. She saw a land agent hurrying down the hall, his arms full of maps. She saw a housekeeper consulting a large ring of keys with a frown of concentration. Eleanor simply nodded politely as she passed, a serene and distant figure. No one questioned her presence. She was the new Duchess. She belonged here, and yet she was entirely invisible. It was the perfect cover. Her explorations eventually led her to the gardens. She pushed open a set of heavy glass doors and stepped out into the crisp autumn air. The grounds were vast and meticulously manicured. There were rose gardens, now dormant for the winter, a large ornamental lake, and winding paths that disappeared into thick stands of ancient trees. The sky above was a sheet of pale, washed-out gray. She began to walk along a gravel path that bordered the great lawn. The crunch of her shoes was the only sound. The sheer scale of the estate was meant to intimidate, to communicate a message of insurmountable power and wealth. Her own childhood home had been a comfortable, sprawling manor, but it had been a place of life and laughter. Its gardens had been slightly wild, full of her mother's favorite flowers and trees perfect for climbing. This place was a monument, cold, perfect, and lifeless. She walked for what felt like a long time, her mind carefully piecing together the map of the manor. She thought about the locked library, the busy offices, the sheer number of rooms she had yet to see. The task before her felt immense, almost impossible. It was like trying to find a single grain of sand on a vast empty beach. But her father's face, full of trust and warmth from the pages of his journal, solidified her resolve. She would not fail him. High above her, in a second-floor study in the East Wing, Duke Alistair Blackwood stood at the window, a pen still in his hand. He had been trying to work, to review quarterly reports from the estate's tenants, but his concentration was shattered. Her words from last night echoed in his mind. "As I will be watching you." It was so audacious, so utterly unexpected. He had married the daughter of a traitor, a girl from a ruined house, to secure a final symbolic victory. He had expected a broken, pliable little thing he could install in his home like a piece of furniture. Instead, he got Eleanor Vance, quiet, composed, and with eyes that held a sorrow so deep it looked like steel. He had watched her at breakfast from a distance. She ate little, her gaze distant, as if she were 1,000 miles away. And now he watched her walk his grounds. From his vantage point, she looked small and fragile against the vast, sweeping landscape of his ancestral home. A solitary figure in gray, moving with a strange, unnerving purpose. She was not wandering aimlessly, admiring the view. Her pace was steady, her head turning methodically, taking everything in. It looked less like a leisurely stroll and more like a reconnaissance mission. The suspicion he had felt since their wedding flared hot and sharp. What was she planning? What game was she playing with her quiet defiance and watchful eyes? He was the Duke, he was in control. But as he watched her, a different, unwelcome thought intruded. It was a flicker of something he could not name. It was not admiration, and it was certainly not pity. It was curiosity, a deep, unsettling curiosity about the woman who was now his wife. He watched her stop at the edge of the lake, a dark silhouette against the pale water. And for the first time, Alistair felt that the battle he had started on his wedding night might be far more complicated than he had ever imagined. The third morning at Blackwood Manor arrived with a pale, watery light that did little to warm the stone corridors. Eleanor had spent the past 2 days in a state of quiet observation, moving through the grand rooms like a ghost, learning the rhythms of the house. She learned the exact time a footman replaced the wilting flowers in the great hall. She knew which grandfather clock in the West Wing ran 3 minutes slow. She had mapped the estate in her mind, a beautiful prison of marble and mahogany, and now it was time to test the bars of her cage. She found her lady's maid Anna, laying out a simple day dress of dark gray wool. The fabric was practical, severe. It was the armor she had chosen for today's campaign. Anna's hands were quick and efficient as she helped Eleanor dress, her presence a small, silent comfort in the oppressive stillness of the room. She was the only person here who knew the truth, the only one who saw the Duchess and still saw the grieving daughter. "He watches you from his study window," Anna said, her voice barely a whisper as she fastened the last button at Eleanor's collar. "When you walk in the gardens, the staff have noticed." Eleanor met Anna's worried gaze in the mirror. "Let him watch," she replied, her own voice steady. "It is his right. It is his house." But inside, a cold knot tightened in her stomach. His curiosity was a variable she had not fully accounted for. Suspicion she expected, but curiosity was more dangerous. It implied he was looking for something more than just a trader's daughter. He was looking at her. After a solitary breakfast served in a cavernous dining room designed for 50, Eleanor walked to the Duke's study. Her heart beat a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. Each footstep on the polished floor seemed to echo with the gravity of her purpose. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her mind. Her request had to be flawless, stripped of all emotion, presented as the simple, irrefutable duty of a new wife. She paused before the heavy oak door, her hand hovering over the cold brass knob. She could smell the faint scent of his cigar smoke and old leather from the hallway. Taking a deep, silent breath, she straightened her spine, smoothed the front of her dress, and knocked twice. The sound was sharp, decisive. Enter, a deep voice commanded from within. Alistair was seated behind a desk so large it looked more like a barricade. Papers were spread before him in organized stacks, and a half-empty glass of amber liquid sat near his elbow. The morning light cut across the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and catching the silver in a letter opener he toyed with in his hand. He did not look up immediately, letting the silence stretch, forcing her to stand there like a petitioner. It was a petty display of power, and she refused to let it unnerve her. Finally, his piercing blue eyes lifted to meet hers. They held no warmth, only a cool, interrogative light. "Duchess," he said, his tone flat, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" Eleanor inclined her head slightly, a gesture of perfect deference. "Your Grace, I hope I am not disturbing you." "You are, but you are here now. State your purpose." She clasped her hands loosely in front of her, a picture of calm humility. "I have come to make a request. As the new Duchess of Blackwood, I feel it is my duty to understand the history and legacy of the family I have joined. It is a formidable history, and I would be remiss if I did not study it properly." He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. A small, humorless smile touched his lips. "You wish to read?" "I wish to learn," she corrected gently. "I believe the manor has a library. I would like your permission to make use of it." Alistair watched her, his gaze unwavering, searching for the slightest crack in her facade. He was trying to read the hidden lines of her intent, to decipher the true meaning behind her simple words. Eleanor held his gaze, her own expression a placid mask. She let him look. She had nothing to hide on her face. Her secrets were buried far deeper than that. "The Blackwood Library is one of the most extensive private collections in the country," he said slowly, as if speaking to a child. "It contains generations of knowledge, of history, of power." He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the room. "And of secrets. You wish to go digging through my family's secrets, Eleanor?" The use of her first name was a deliberate, intimate strike designed to throw her off balance. She did not flinch. "I wish to understand the family's public triumphs, Your Grace, the ledgers of its commerce, the records of its landholdings, the correspondence that shaped its position in the world. I wish to know the story that every other person in this house already seems to know, the story of what makes a Blackwood a Blackwood." Her answer was brilliant in its simplicity. It was an appeal to his pride, to the very foundation of his arrogant identity. She was not asking to pry. She was asking to be indoctrinated. For a long moment he was silent. The only sound was the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant call of a rook from the gardens. He set the letter opener down with a soft click. "Very well," he conceded, though his eyes remained cold and narrow. "You may have access to the library." Relief, sharp and sudden, threatened to show on her face. She held it back, keeping her expression neutral. "However," he continued, his voice dropping to a low, warning tone, "you will not be alone. Mr. Croft, our librarian, has managed the collection for 40 years. He served my father, and now he serves me. He is exceptionally protective of the archives." The meaning was perfectly clear. You will be watched. Every book you touch, every page you turn. "Mr. Croft will provide any assistance you require," Alistair finished, a glint of something like triumph in his eyes. He had granted her request, but he had turned the library into another cell, with a warden of his own choosing. "Thank you, Your Grace," Eleanor said, her voice betraying nothing. "I am sure Mr. Croft and I will get along splendidly." She turned and walked out of the study, her back straight, her steps measured. She did not let herself breathe freely until the heavy door clicked shut behind her, cutting off his suffocating presence. She had won the first skirmish. But he had made it clear the war was just beginning. The library was even more imposing than she had imagined. It was a two-story cathedral of books, smelling of aging paper, beeswax, and a profound, solemn silence. Sunlight struggled through the tall, arched windows, casting long, dusty columns of light across the floor. Ladders on brass rails lined the towering shelves, which stretched up into the shadowy heights of the second-floor gallery. It was a treasure trove of knowledge, and a labyrinth designed to protect its secrets. A small, wizened man with thin white hair and spectacles perched on his nose rose from a desk tucked away in an alcove. He wore a dark, formal suit that seemed to have been tailored in a previous century. His posture was as stiff and straight as the books he guarded. "Your Grace," he said, his voice dry as rustling leaves. He gave a short, jerky bow. This had to be Mr. Croft. "Mr. Croft," Eleanor acknowledged with a nod. "The Duke has granted me permission to use the library." "So I have been informed," the librarian replied, his expression unreadable. "The Duke has instructed me to offer you my full assistance." His eyes, magnified by his glasses, were sharp and watchful. He was not an assistant. He was a sentinel. "Thank you," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "For today I think I would just like to browse, to get a sense of the collection." "As you wish, Your Grace." He gestured vaguely toward the endless shelves. "The sections are arranged thematically. History, philosophy, the sciences, literature. The family archives and estate records are on the north wall." He had pointed her exactly where she wanted to go, but she knew it was a test. If she went there immediately, her interest would be noted. Her mission would be compromised before it had even begun. So she started with poetry. For the first hour, she wandered through the literature section, pulling down volumes of Keats and Wordsworth. She sat in a worn leather armchair by the window, the heavy book open in her lap, her eyes on the page. But she wasn't reading. She was feeling the oppressive weight of Mr. Croft's gaze from across the room. She could hear the subtle scrape of his chair, the rustle of a page he turned, the soft, judgmental clearing of his throat. She was an actress on a stage, and he was her sole critical audience. Her mind was a whirlwind. She thought of her father's journal, of the passage she had reread last night. He had written of his business with Theron Blackwood, the old Duke. He had described their shared ventures not with suspicion, but with the excitement of a scholar embarking on a new discovery. "My friend Theron," he had written, "has a mind for commerce that is as sharp as a razor. He sees patterns in the numbers that I, with my books and theories, could never perceive. Together, we will build something that lasts." Tears pricked at the back of her eyes. Her father, the kindest, most brilliant man she had ever known, had walked into a trap with his eyes wide open, blinded by friendship and trust. And the man who had set that trap, Theron Blackwood, had built this library, this monument to his own legacy, with the fortune he had stolen. The poetry in her lap felt like a mockery. After a respectable amount of time, she replaced the book and moved toward the history section. She feigned an interest in military campaigns and political treatises, her fingers trailing along the leather spines. All the while, she was subtly mapping the room, noting the layout, the cataloging system. The sheer volume of information was overwhelming. There were thousands upon thousands of books. Her quest felt impossible. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed noon. Mr. Croft remained at his desk, unmoving. He had not taken a break. He had not even looked away. He was a statue of loyalty. Finally, in the mid-afternoon, when the light began to fade and the shadows grew long, she allowed herself to drift toward the north wall. This was it. The air here felt different, heavier. The shelves were filled not with poetry or philosophy, but with thick, leather-bound ledgers, deed boxes, and stacks of indexed correspondence. This was the engine room of the Blackwood Empire. Her heart began to beat faster. She ran her fingers over the embossed gold lettering on the spines. Estate accounts, 1900, 1901. Shipping manifests, East India Company. She had to appear casual, her interest merely that of a curious new mistress of the house. Mr. Croft had risen from his desk and was now reshelving a small stack of books nearby. He was closer now, his presence of physical pressures on her back. She could feel his suspicion like a cold draft. She forced herself to breathe evenly. She pulled out a random ledger from a decade past, flipping through its pages. The spidery script detailed crop yields, livestock sales, and tenant rents. It was mundane, ordinary. She placed it back on the shelf and moved further down the line, her eyes scanning the dates. Her search was for a specific period, a single catastrophic year that had shattered her world. The year her father's shipping company had collapsed. The year he was accused of fraud, of embezzling funds from his partnership with Duke Theron Blackwood. The year he had lost everything, his fortune, his name, his will to live. Her fingers traced the spines. 1898, 1899. She kept moving, her breath catching in her throat. 1900, 1901. The numbers marched on in perfect, chronological order. She was getting closer. Her hand reached the section where the crucial year should have been. Her stomach dropped. She saw the ledger for 1902, and right next to it, the ledger for 1904. She stopped. Her fingers hovered over the empty space on the shelf. It was a gap no wider than her hand, but it felt like a chasm. She ran her hand back and forth, checking again. 1899, 1900, 1901, 1902. Then the gap. Then 1904. 1903 was gone. The ledgers, the shipping manifests, the private correspondence. Every single record from the year of her father's ruin was conspicuously, impossibly missing. It was not an accident. An entire year could not simply vanish from an archive as meticulously kept as this one. It had been removed. It had been hidden. A cold certainty washed over her, chilling her to the bone. She looked at the empty space on the shelf, the dark wood staring back at her. She had not found the proof she was looking for. She had found something far more important. She had found the proof that there was something to find. From behind her, Mr. Croft cleared his throat. "Is there something specific you are looking for, Your Grace?" he asked, his voice laced with a careful, pointed curiosity. Eleanor slowly pulled her hand back from the shelf and turned to face him. She composed her features into a mask of mild disappointment, the perfect picture of a duchess whose idle curiosity had been thwarted. "No, nothing specific," she lied, her voice a placid sea above the storm raging within her. "I was just noticing the organization. It is quite remarkable." The librarian watched her, his old eyes sharp, trying to gauge her sincerity. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought he could see right through her, that he knew exactly what she had discovered. But then he simply nodded. The late Duke Theron was a man of impeccable order. The name hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. Eleanor looked from the watchful librarian back to the empty space on the shelf. The proof was not here, but the absence was a confession. Her enemy was not a ghost. He was a man who had gone to great lengths to bury his crimes. And for the first time since she had walked through the doors of Blackwood Manor, Eleanor felt a flicker not of despair, but of hope. The hunt had truly begun. The dead end felt colder than any corner of the manor. For 3 days, Eleanor had returned to the library, her search growing more methodical, more desperate. The discovery that the ledgers from the year of her father's fall were missing was not just a setback. It was a statement, a lock on a door she hadn't even known existed. The public history of the Blackwood family was pristine, curated, and utterly useless. The truth she now understood was not simply hidden, it had been surgically removed. She ran a finger along a row of intact ledgers from other years, the leather bindings cool and impersonal. The air smelled of aging paper and the faint, cloying scent of beeswax used to polish the shelves. Each morning the librarian, a man with eyes as dusty as the tomes he guarded, would unlock the doors for her. He would watch from his desk as she fruitlessly pulled down volume after volume, his silence a constant knowing judgment. She was a curiosity, the trader's daughter playing scholar in the house of her conqueror. The feeling of being watched was a physical weight on her shoulders, making her movements stiff and her breath shallow. Her hope, once a steady flame, had become a flickering ember. The library was a labyrinth designed to lead nowhere. Her father's journal, which she read each night, felt less like a guide and more like a collection of memories from a world that no longer existed. His words on honor and integrity echoed in the hollow space where the proof of those virtues should have been. She was failing him. The thought was a shard of ice in her heart. On the 4th evening, Alistair found her not in the library, but staring out the long gallery window at the rain-slicked gardens. He didn't announce himself, but she felt his presence the way one feels a change in air pressure before a storm. The fine hairs on her arms stood up. She kept her gaze fixed on the darkening grounds, refusing to give him the satisfaction of her turning first. "We will have guests for dinner on Friday," he said. His voice was flat, a statement of fact, not an invitation for discussion. "Lord and Lady Pemberton, and Mr. Davies. They are old associates of my father's." Eleanor finally turned, Her expression was placid, a carefully constructed mask of ducal grace. Inside, her stomach tightened. Associates of his father. Men who would have known her father too. Men who would have watched him fall and likely applauded. "I will see to the arrangements," she replied, her voice a perfect, cool monotone. Alistair studied her for a moment, his piercing blue eyes searching for a crack in her composure. He was always searching. "You will be expected to preside as the Duchess. I trust you understand the duties that entails." It was not a request for assurance. It was a command wrapped in the thinnest veil of courtesy. "I understand perfectly," she said, her chin lifting almost imperceptibly. "I will not bring shame upon the Blackwood name." The words tasted like ash, but she delivered them without a tremor. He gave a curt nod, seemingly satisfied, and left as silently as he had arrived. Alone again, Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself. This dinner was not a social occasion. It was a test, a performance on a stage she had not chosen, for an audience that already despised her. She walked back to her rooms, the echo of her own footsteps on the marble floors sounding unnervingly loud in the vast empty hall. Friday arrived with a persistent, dreary drizzle that blurred the windows and cast the manor in an even deeper gloom. Eleanor allowed Anna to help her dress, the familiar ritual, a small comfort in the mounting dread. Anna moved with quiet efficiency, her hands arranging the heavy silk of the gown, a deep charcoal gray that seemed to absorb the little light in the room. It was a dress that announced sobriety and status, a piece of armor disguised as fashion. "You are pale, my lady," Anna murmured, her gaze meeting Eleanor's in the mirror. "I am merely tired," Eleanor lied, though Anna, who knew her better than anyone, would not be fooled. "These men," Anna said, her voice dropping lower, "the ones coming tonight, they were his father's circle. Vultures, your own father called them once. Be careful. They feed on weakness." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists in her lap. "I have no weakness left to feed them, Anna." She took a deep breath, the stays of her corset digging into her ribs. "I am a Blackwood now. I will be as cold and hard as the stone of this house." Anna said nothing more, but her expression was fraught with a worry that mirrored Eleanor's own tightly coiled fear. When she was finally ready, Eleanor stood before the mirror. The woman looking back was a stranger. Her auburn hair was swept into a severe chignon, not a single strand out of place. Her gray eyes were shadowed, her face a pale oval in the dim light. She looked like a ghost already haunting the halls of her own life. She was the Duchess Eleanor Blackwood, and tonight she would play her part. The dining room at Blackwood Manor was a cavern of mahogany and silver. A long, dark table, polished to a mirror finish, reflected the dozens of flickering candles from the ornate candelabra. The flames danced, casting long, wavering shadows that made the stern faces in the ancestral portraits lining the walls seem to move, their painted eyes following the proceedings with silent disapproval. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat, spiced wine, and the subtle metallic tang of old money. Eleanor sat at one end of the table, a statue of composure. Alistair sat at the other, a formidable and remote presence. Between them sat their guests. Lord Pemberton was a large man with a florid face and a voice that boomed, filling every silence. His wife was a thin, bird-like woman whose eyes darted everywhere, cataloging every detail. Mr. Davies was quieter, a solicitor with a lean face and watchful eyes that missed nothing. The conversation was a dull river of society gossip, politics, and talk of hunting seasons. Eleanor ate sparingly, the food tasteless in her mouth. She listened, her mind a cold, clear instrument, filing away the nuances of their speech, the alliances and rivalries hinted at between the lines. She felt Alistair's gaze on her from time to time, an intense, assessing look. She met it only once, her own expression unreadable, before returning her attention to her plate. Her fork felt heavy in her hand. She focused on the simple mechanics of eating to keep her hands from trembling. It was Lord Pemberton, flushed with wine, who finally steered the conversation into dangerous waters. He was telling a story about a land acquisition from 2 decades ago, a triumphant tale of his own shrewdness. "Of course," he boomed, gesturing with his wine glass. "Theron, your father, Alistair, he was the master. Knew how to handle men, knew who to trust and who to cut loose." Mr. Davies gave a dry, thin-lipped smile. He had an unparalleled instinct for weakness. The table fell quiet for a moment. Eleanor felt a chill crawl up her spine. She knew where this was going. She could feel the trap being laid, the casual cruelty about to be deployed. She braced herself, her entire body tensing. Pemberton leaned back in his chair, his eyes finding Eleanor's down the long stretch of the table. His smile was condescending. "A pity about your father, Duchess," he said, his voice laced with false sympathy. "Julian Vance, a brilliant man in his way, but his ambition got the better of him. A traitor to his friends, they say." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Lady Pemberton shot a nervous glance at her husband. Mr. Davies watched Eleanor with keen analytical interest. The clinking of silverware stopped. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sputtering of the candles. Eleanor could feel every eye in the room on her. They were waiting for the tears, the outburst, the predictable display of feminine fragility, waiting for her to prove she was nothing more than the daughter of a ruined man. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to lash out, to defend her father's name with the ferocity of her grief. The insult was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She saw her father's face in her mind, not as the world remembered him, a disgraced failure, but as she knew him. Kind, scholarly, his eyes lit with intelligence and love. The injustice of it all threatened to swamp her. She lowered her fork to her plate with a quiet, deliberate click. She took a slow, steadying breath. She could feel Alistair's stare, hard as granite, from the other end of the table. He was tensed, his jaw set. He was about to speak, to take control of the situation, to put her and this uncomfortable topic back in their place. He would either shut Pemberton down to preserve decorum, or worse, quietly affirm the sentiment to remind her of her station. But before he could utter a word, Eleanor spoke. Her voice was not loud. It was soft, yet it carried down the entire length of the table with the clarity of a bell. It sliced through the oppressive silence. "Lord Pemberton," she began, her eyes meeting his directly. There was no anger in her gaze, only a profound, unnerving stillness. "My father was a great admirer of the philosopher Marcus Aurelius." A flicker of confusion crossed Pemberton's face. He had expected a passionate defense or a tearful retreat, not a lesson in classical literature. Eleanor paused, letting the silence stretch for a beat, drawing all focus to her. "He often reminded me that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." She held his gaze, her own unwavering. "My father's thoughts were of scholarship, of loyalty, and of progress. The contents of his library were his greatest treasure. The ideas within it his constant companions." She gave the smallest, most dismissive of smiles. "I believe a man's true character is defined by the contents of his mind, not the gossip of the market." The rebuke was masterful. It was elegant, intelligent, and utterly unassailable. She had not defended her father from the charge of treason. She had dismissed the very premise of their judgment. She had lifted the conversation from the grubby world of finance and reputation to the lofty realm of philosophy, a place where a bore like Pemberton could not follow. A deep, shocked silence descended upon the table. Lord Pemberton's face, already red from wine, deepened to a shade of purple. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, utterly disarmed. Lady Pemberton looked down at her plate as if she might find the answer there. Mr. Davies' lips quirked in what might have been a flicker of admiration. And Alistair stared at her. His face was a mask of astonishment. He had been ready for a scene. He had been prepared to be embarrassed by his new wife. He had expected her to crumble. Instead, she had risen to the occasion with a grace and intellectual firepower that he had never imagined. She had not only defended her family's honor, but she had done so in a way that made her opponent look foolish and crude. She had controlled the room, and she had done it without raising her voice. For the first time since he had met her, Alistair looked at Eleanor and saw something other than the ghost of a dead conflict. He saw a woman of formidable strength, a mind as sharp as his own, perhaps sharper. The contempt he had so carefully nurtured was pierced by a feeling he could not immediately name. It was a grudging, startling flicker of respect. Eleanor picked up her wine glass, her hand perfectly steady, and took a small sip. The performance was over. She had survived. More than survived, she realized. She had won. The power dynamic at the table had irrevocably shifted. The rest of the dinner passed in a strained, formal haze. Lord Pemberton was subdued, the conversation stilted. When the guests finally departed, bowing and scraping their way out into the damp night, the relief in the great hall was palpable. Eleanor stood near the massive fireplace, the warmth doing little to touch the chill deep within her bones. She had done it. She had honored her father in the only way she could. Alistair walked toward her, stopping a few feet away. The space between them crackled with unspoken thoughts. The air was thick with everything that had happened and everything that had not been said. He did not congratulate her. He did not mention the incident at all. To do so would be to admit she had bested his father's old friend, that she had shown a strength he hadn't anticipated. He simply looked at her, his blue eyes intense and unreadable in the firelight. "It is late," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was a dismissal. "Yes, Your Grace," she replied, inclining her head. She turned and walked away, her back straight, her steps measured, and even as she ascended the grand staircase. She did not look back, but she could feel his eyes on her until she disappeared from view. Later that night, Alistair stood in his study, a glass of brandy in his hand, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The room was dark, the portraits of his ancestors shrouded in shadow. He had always seen this marriage as a transaction, a political necessity, the acquisition of a defeated family's last asset. He had married the name Vance, a symbol of betrayal that his father had crushed. He had expected to tame her, to watch her slowly fade into the background of his life, a sad reminder of his family's power. But the woman he had seen tonight was not a symbol. She was not a sad defeated girl. He replayed the scene at the dinner table over and over, the hush of the room, the smug cruelty on Pemberton's face. In Eleanor's voice, quiet and clear, cutting through it all. The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. It was brilliant. It was devastating. He had felt a strange, unwelcome surge of pride in that moment. It was an unsettling, disloyal feeling. Pride in the daughter of the man his father had destroyed. He swirled the brandy in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the faint light. He had spent weeks watching her with suspicion, waiting for a sign of conspiracy or weakness. He had found neither. He had found only a quiet, sorrowful dignity and, tonight, a will of solid steel. Alistair stared into the dying fire, the glass cold in his hand. His carefully constructed image of her was fracturing, falling away. He found himself thinking not of the traitor's daughter, not of the Vance girl he had been forced to wed. He was thinking of the woman with the defiant eyes. Alistair no longer looked at her with pure contempt. The change was subtle, a barely perceptible shift in the cold blue of his eyes when they met hers across the dinner table. It was not warmth, not by any measure. It was a grudging curiosity, the look a man gives an opponent who has made an unexpectedly clever move on the chessboard. Eleanor felt it, but she took no comfort from it. His respect was a complication, a faint tremor in the foundation of her resolve. It was easier to hate a monster. It was dangerous to understand the man. Her thoughts returned, as they always did, to the library. The missing ledgers were a gaping hole in the history of the house, a silence that screamed louder than any accusation. An entire year's worth of financial records, the very year her father's world had collapsed, had vanished. She had spent days searching, her fingers tracing the spines of countless books, her hope dwindling with each empty shelf. It was clear the proof she sought was not simply misplaced. It was hidden, deliberately. The knowledge settled in her bones, cold and certain. The records would not be in a public space. They would be somewhere private, somewhere secure, somewhere Alistair felt completely safe. Her gaze drifted to the heavy oak door of his personal study at the far end of the West Wing corridor. It was a fortress within a fortress, a room she was implicitly and absolutely forbidden from entering. The thought of it was a locked gate, and her mission was to find the key. So she began to watch him. Her life in Blackwood Manor narrowed into a singular, silent purpose, the study of Duke Alistair Blackwood. She became a ghost in her own home, a shadow at the edge of his perception. Her new routine was one of meticulous observation. At breakfast, While he read his letters, she would note the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed on the table when a particular correspondence displeased him. She learned the rhythm of his footsteps in the hall, a heavy, confident stride that never faltered. She knew he spent precisely 1 hour in his study after breakfast and 2 hours there before retiring for the night. The library remained their shared territory, a silent battlefield. He would work at the massive mahogany desk, engrossed in estate papers, while she sat in a distant alcove, a book open on her lap. But she was not reading. Her eyes were fixed on the play of light and shadow on the walls, on the endless rows of books, and most of all, on him. She watched how he moved through the space, the way he would sometimes rise from his chair to pace, his path a predictable line on the Persian rug between the desk and the fireplace. He was a creature of habit, of rigid, unyielding routine. And in that rigidity, she hoped to find a weakness. One evening, as a cold rain lashed against the tall, arched windows, Anna came to her chambers. Her lady's maid moved with her usual quiet efficiency, laying out Eleanor's nightgown, her face a mask of placid service. But when the door was shut and bolted, the mask fell away. Anna's eyes, normally downcast, were bright with urgency. "My lady," she began, her voice a low whisper. "I was helping in the kitchens today." The older staff, they talk when they think no one is listening. Eleanor sat perfectly still in her chair by the window, her hands clasped in her lap. She did not prompt her. She simply waited, letting the silence draw the words out. "They were speaking of the old Duke, of Duke Theron." Anna paused, twisting a piece of her apron in her hands. "They say he was a man who trusted no one, not even his own shadow." Eleanor's heart gave a slow, heavy beat. This was the territory she needed to explore. "Go on, Anna." "There is talk of his study, not the one the new Duke uses. Another one, his private place." Anna took a hesitant step closer. "They say it was sealed the day after his funeral, that Duke Alistair gave the order himself. No one has been inside in years. Some of the younger maids don't even know it exists." The air in the room grew thick, charged with the weight of the revelation. A sealed room, a room untouched since the death of the man who had orchestrated her family's ruin. It was perfect. It was terrifying. A cold wave of certainty washed over Eleanor. The ledgers were in that room. Her father's vindication, her entire future, was locked behind a wall somewhere in this cold, sprawling house. "Where is it?" Eleanor's voice was barely audible, but it was steady. Anna shook her head, her expression filled with her frustration. "That's the thing, my lady, no one knows. Or if they do, they are too afraid to say. The old butler, Mr. Gable, he would know. But he is loyal to the Duke. He would never speak of it." Eleanor looked out at the rain-streaked glass, seeing not her own reflection, but the layout of the manor in her mind. A sealed room. It could be anywhere. But Duke Theron, a man of business and secrets, would have kept it close. He would have wanted his records within reach. Her mind immediately flew to the library. It was the heart of the estate's knowledge, the most logical place to conceal a secondary secret chamber. "Thank you, Anna," Eleanor said, her voice regaining its composure. "You have been a great help. Be careful. Do not ask any more questions about this." "Of course, my lady," Anna replied, relief softening her features. "I worry for you." "You need not," Eleanor said, though the words felt hollow. "I am exactly where I need to be." After Anna left, Eleanor remained by the window for a long time. The gossip had given her a destination, but she still had no map. Her search was no longer for a book, but for a door that did not look like a door. Her observation of Alistair intensified, but now it had a razor-sharp focus. She was no longer just watching him. She was watching how he interacted with his environment, especially in the library. Days turned into a week. The fragile truce between them held. They exchanged polite, empty words at mealtimes. He would occasionally ask about her day, and she would give a placid, brief account of her reading. He seemed to have accepted her presence in the library as a permanent fixture, an inconvenient but harmless piece of the household furniture. The condescension in his tone had lessened, replaced by a kind of weary vigilance. He was still watching her, but he no longer seemed to be waiting for her to steal the family silver. Eleanor used the time to study the library's architecture. It was a masterpiece of Gothic design, with dark oak paneling and intricately carved shelves that soared 2 stories high. She ran her fingers over the wooden reliefs, feeling for seams, for hollow spots, for anything that felt out of place. She noted the patterns in the woodwork, the repeating motifs of lions and griffins, the stern faces of forgotten scholars carved into the ends of the bookshelves. The room was a puzzle, and she was determined to solve it. One evening, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and beeswax from the flickering candles. A fire crackled in the grand fireplace, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. Alistair was at his desk, a furrow in his brow as he reviewed a stack of documents related to a tenant dispute. He seemed agitated, sighing heavily and running a hand through his dark hair. Eleanor sat in her usual chair, the heavy volume of poetry in her lap a mere prop. Her attention was entirely on him. He pushed his chair back with a scraping sound and began to pace, his usual path, desk to fireplace, fireplace to desk. He was muttering to himself, his frustration a palpable energy in the quiet room. Eleanor kept her eyes lowered, feigning absorption in her book, but she watched him through her lashes. He stopped his pacing near a section of shelving to the left of the fireplace. It was a particularly ornate section, filled with leather-bound volumes on ancient history. He leaned against it, his back to her, staring into the flames. His left hand rested against the bookshelf, his fingers spread wide against the dark wood. It was an idle, thoughtless gesture, but then his thumb began to move. He traced the outline of a carved griffin, a slow, repetitive motion. Up the wing, across the snarling mouth, down the clawed foot. He did it once, twice, 3 times. It was a nervous habit, the kind of absent-minded fiddling a person does when their mind is deeply troubled. Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. She forced herself to remain still, to keep her breathing even. After a few moments, he pushed himself off the wall and returned to his desk, his mood seemingly unchanged. He picked up his pen and went back to work, the brief moment of distraction apparently forgotten. But Eleanor had not forgotten. The image was burned into her mind, the specific shelf, the carved griffin, the path his thumb had traced. An hour later, as he was preparing to leave, the moment repeated itself. He stood up, stretched, and walked toward the fireplace to warm his hands one last time before retiring. As he turned to leave the room, his hand brushed against the same bookshelf. For a fleeting second, his fingers settled into the same position, his thumb resting directly on the griffin's head. It was not as deliberate as before, just a passing touch, a moment of contact so brief it was almost imperceptible. Almost. Eleanor's heart was a drum against her ribs. It was not random. It was a pattern, an unconscious point of contact, a place his body was drawn to without his mind's command. She watched him walk out of the library, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, leaving her alone in the vast, silent room. Her gaze remained fixed on the bookshelf. The polished wood seemed to hum with a secret energy. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she was looking at the door to Duke Theron's sealed study. She had not found the key, but she had found the lock. And she had seen the Duke's own hand show her exactly where it was. The silence in the library was a fragile thing, easily broken by the sharp rustle of parchment. For 3 days, Alistair had turned the vast room into his command center. Maps were spread across the central table like the flayed skin of his estate, held down by heavy glass paperweights. He paced the perimeter, a caged predator in his own home, the scent of his frustration sharp in the air. Eleanor sat in her usual corner, a book of verse open on her lap, its pages unturned for the better part of an hour. She kept her breathing even, her posture serene. Inside, she was a tightly coiled spring, absorbing every detail of his agitation. He was in a battle with Lord Ashworth, a neighboring landowner whose family had been rivals of the Blackwoods for generations. The dispute was over water rights to a creek that fed both their lands. Ashworth had begun constructing a new dam, citing a recent land survey that gave him the authority. Alistair knew it was wrong, a blatant power grab, but the documents he possessed were ambiguous. His stewards came and went, their faces grim, offering no solutions. Alistair's voice, when he spoke to them, was a low, dangerous rumble. Eleanor watched him run a hand through his dark hair, his knuckles white. The name Ashworth had snagged her memory, pulling a thread from the tapestry of her past. She closed her eyes for a second, the image of her father's journal clear in her mind. He had written about a similar dispute almost 30 years prior. Her father, a scholar before he was a businessman, had found the solution not in recent surveys, but in the deep history of the land. He had detailed his research, the long hours spent with crumbling charters and forgotten royal decrees. He had found the original grant, a document that predated both the Blackwood and Ashworth claims as they currently stood. The knowledge burned in her mind. It was a weapon. She could use it. For the first time since her arrival, she had something he needed. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. To offer it was to make herself visible, to step out from the shadows of her grief and into the harsh light of his scrutiny. It was a risk. He could question how she knew. He could dismiss her out of pure spite for her family name. Or he could listen. He could see that she was more than the daughter of a supposed traitor. She was the daughter of a brilliant man. Her fingers tightened on her book. This was not just about water. It was about her father. It was a chance to use his wisdom, his legacy, as the first stone in the foundation of his vindication. She would not let the opportunity pass. She waited, her patience a honed blade. She watched Alistair dismiss his estate manager with a curt, final wave of his hand. The man bowed and retreated, leaving the Duke alone with his fury. The room fell silent again, filled only with the crackle of the fire and the heavy weight of Alistair's brooding. Now she stood, her movements fluid and quiet. The soft rustle of her dress was the only sound as she crossed the polished floor. He did not look up until she was standing a few feet from the table of maps. His blue eyes, when they met hers, were cold and impatient. "What is it?" he asked. His tone was not a question, but a demand. Eleanor inclined her head slightly. "Forgive my interruption, Your Grace. I could not help but overhear your discussions regarding the dispute with Lord Ashworth." A muscle jumped in his jaw. "The entire house can likely overhear my discussions. I am in no mood for idle chatter, Duchess." She held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "It is not idle chatter. I seem to recall my father speaking of a similar issue many years ago. It also involved the Ashworth estate and the water rights to Miller's Creek." Alistair's expression soured instantly at the mention of her father. "I have no interest in the dealings of Lord Vance." "Perhaps not," she said, her voice remaining soft, yet gaining a thread of steel. "But you may have an interest in how he resolved the matter. He found that both the modern Blackwood and Ashworth deeds were superseded by an older agreement, a riparian treaty tied to the original royal charter from the 1700s. He stared at her, his initial contempt warring with a flicker of something else. He was a man who valued facts and leverage above all else. She was offering him a specific, verifiable piece of information. It was not a vague rumor. It was a legal angle, a historical precedent. He walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of her. His height and presence meant to dominate. "And how would you recall such a specific detail?" he asked, his voice low and suspicious. "My father was a man of letters, Your Grace. He enjoyed history. He spoke of it often. He found the dispute intellectually stimulating." She chose her words with surgical precision. Every statement was true, but incomplete. He mentioned that the original grant specified the water could not be impeded in any way that would affect the lower pastures. The document was an addendum to the King's grant of 1721. I believe he said it was stored in the county archives. Not here. Alistair was silent for a long moment. He studied her face, searching for any sign of deceit. He saw only a quiet, solemn woman with sorrowful gray eyes. He saw the woman who had quoted philosophers at his dinner table. He saw the wife he had taken for strategic purposes, who had until now been nothing but a silent, ghostly presence in his home. The information was too precise to be a lucky guess. If it were true, it would give him the unshakable legal ground he needed to crush Ashworth's ambitions. If it were false, it was a foolish and easily disproven lie. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. He did not thank her. He did not acknowledge the potential value of her contribution. He simply turned his back on her, walked to his desk, and began to write a letter, his quill scratching furiously against the paper. Eleanor understood. She had been dismissed. She returned to her chair, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had laid her first card on the table. Now she could only wait to see how he would play his hand. 2 days passed in quiet tension. The librarian, a stern woman named Mrs. Gable, resumed her post, her watchful eyes following Eleanor's every move. Alistair was absent from the manor, having ridden out early the morning after their conversation. Eleanor did not ask where he had gone. She did not need to. She spent her time poring over books on local botany, the words blurring before her eyes. Her entire being was focused on the outcome of her gamble. If she had been wrong or if he failed, her position would be weaker than ever. She would have made a fool of herself, confirming his belief that Avance was nothing but trouble. On the evening of the second day, she was in the library alone. Mrs. Gable had retired for the night, locking the doors behind her as she always did. Eleanor was allowed to remain until she wished to go to her own chambers, at which point a footman would let her out. She was reading near the fireplace, the warmth a small comfort in the vast, chilly room. The main library door opened, and she looked up to see Alistair enter. He was still in his riding clothes, his boots dusty and his coat slung over one arm. He looked tired, but the frustrated anger that had surrounded him for days was gone. In its place was a quiet, calculating stillness. He walked directly to her, stopping before her chair. She resisted the urge to stand, instead looking up at him, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "The county archives held the document you described," he said. There was no preamble. "The Riparian Treaty from 1721. It was exactly where you indicated it might be." Eleanor felt a slow, deep wave of relief wash over her, but she kept her expression neutral. She simply nodded. "I am pleased the information was of use." "Of use?" A dry, humorless smile touched his lips for a fleeting second. "Lord Ashworth is currently dismantling his dam. His lawyers received a copy of the treaty this afternoon. It seems your father's intellectual curiosity has saved this estate a significant sum and a great deal of future trouble." He paused, and the silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. This was the moment. He was a proud man, a duke who believed himself to be the absolute authority in his world. He had just been forced to concede that the daughter of his enemy, a woman he held in contempt, had succeeded where he and all his men had failed. He looked away from her, toward the fire. "Thank you," he said. The words were clipped, almost harsh, as if they pained him to speak them. But they were genuine. She could hear it in the low timbre of his voice. It was the sound of a debt being acknowledged. Eleanor inclined her head again. "You are welcome, Your Grace." He turned to leave, and she expected to hear the familiar sound of his footsteps retreating down the hall. Instead, he stopped at the door. He looked back at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "Mrs. Gable will not be attending you in the library from now on," he said. "I trust you will treat the family archives with the respect they deserve." And with that, he was gone. He pulled the heavy oak door closed behind him. Eleanor sat perfectly still, listening. She heard his footsteps fade down the corridor. She heard the distant chime of a clock in the main hall. But she did not hear the sound she had grown to expect. She did not hear the heavy, metallic click of the key turning in the lock. A breath she had been holding for what felt like years escaped her lips in a silent, shaky sigh. She was alone. The library, the heart of the Blackwood legacy, was hers. The door was unlocked. For the first time, she felt not like a prisoner, but like a hunter who had just been given the key to the forest. Her eyes drifted across the room, past the endless shelves of books, and settled on the ornate, carved bookshelf she had seen him touch. The path was clearer now. One lock had been opened. She would find a way to open the other. The annual Blackwood Autumn Ball was a crushing weight of silk and expectation. Eleanor stood beside Alistair at the top of the grand staircase, a marble precipice overlooking a sea of glittering jewels and tailored coats. The scent of 1,000 hothouse roses mingled with beeswax from the countless candles, their flames dancing in the drafty hall. Her gown, a deep sapphire velvet Alistair had simply had delivered to her room, felt like a costume. It was the Duchess's skin, not her own. For hours she had smiled until her cheeks ached, her voice a low, pleasant murmur as she greeted earls and their wives, financiers and their ambitious daughters. Each handshake was a careful calculation. Each polite inquiry was a test. She was the fallen Vance girl, now wearing the Blackwood crest. She could feel their eyes on her, searching for a crack in the facade, a hint of her family's shame. But Eleanor gave them nothing. She was poised, graceful, and utterly remote. She had learned the names and histories of every major guest, a feat of memory that was part of her nightly study in the library. She was playing the part of the perfect duchess, and she was playing it flawlessly. Alistair was a formidable presence beside her. He moved with an innate leonine grace, his authority as natural to him as breathing. He would incline his head, his deep voice cutting cleanly through the polite din to offer a sharp observation or a dry joke. To the world, they were a picture of aristocratic power, a handsome, commanding duke and his serene, beautiful wife, a united front. Only Eleanor knew the truth. They were two generals from opposing armies, forced into a temporary and deeply suspicious truce. Every so often, their eyes would meet over the heads of the crowd. In his gaze, she saw not warmth, but a grudging approval. She was performing her duty well. She was an asset tonight, not a liability. That was all. And for her, each glance was a reminder of the chasm between them. This man, who wore his family's honor like a suit of armor, had no idea that its foundation was rotten to the core. He had no idea that the quiet woman by his side was plotting to bring the entire edifice down. Later, the orchestra swelled into a waltz, and the great ballroom became a swirling vortex of color and movement. Alistair was claimed for a dance by a visiting baroness, leaving Eleanor momentarily free. She did not accept any of the offered hands, instead citing a need for a moment of quiet. She drifted toward the edges of the room, a ship seeking a calm harbor. Her gaze swept past the dancers, past the champagne fountains, and landed, as it always did, on the library doors. They were slightly ajar, a dark, quiet mouth in the brightly lit wall, the heart of the house, the heart of her mission. Anna appeared at her elbow, her plain servant's dress a stark contrast to the finery around them. She offered Eleanor a glass of water on a small silver tray. "You look tired, Your Grace," Anna said, her voice barely a whisper. Eleanor took the glass, her fingers grateful for its cold solidity. "It is a long night," she replied, her own voice just as low. "Have you heard anything?" "Only the usual," Anna murmured, her eyes scanning the room. "They say the Duke is a lucky man, that you are more than they expected, more steel than the Vances were known for." Eleanor felt a bitter smile touch her lips. Steel was forged in fire. They had no idea. "And the Duke?" she asked. "He is arguing. His uncle, Lord Harrington, arrived an hour ago. He is displeased about the water rights settlement." Eleanor's entire body went still. The land dispute. The treaty she had found in her father's notes. She had given Alistair the tool to win, and now his own family was challenging him for it. She scanned the room, her eyes seeking him out. She found him near the library entrance, backed against the wall. He was no longer the confident, charming host. His shoulders were tense, his jaw tight. Lord Harrington, a portly man with a florid face and a booming voice, was jabbing a finger toward him. "To yield to the Mortons on a Blackwood claim, that is weakness, Alistair." Harrington's voice carried even over the music. "Your father would never have allowed it. He would have crushed them." "My father is not here," Alistair bit back, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The treaty was ironclad. To fight it would have been a waste of coin and political capital. "The matter is settled." "It is a matter of honors," Eleanor watched, frozen. She felt a strange, unwelcome pang of sympathy for Alistair. He was trapped between the ghost of his ruthless father and the modern realities of managing the estate. Harrington represented the old way, the brute force that had built the Blackwood fortune and destroyed her family. Alistair, for all his arrogance, was trying to be a different kind of duke. And then it happened. As his uncle continued his tirade, Alistair's posture shifted. He was distracted, furious, and not thinking about his audience. His right hand, which had been clenched into a fist at his side, drifted up. He rested it against the wall, against the very section of ornate bookshelves she had been watching for weeks. His fingers found the carved paneling. It was the same unconscious gesture she had seen before. But this time was different. This time, he was not calm. He was agitated, his movements driven by deep, ingrained habit. Her breath caught in her throat. The world seemed to slow down. The music of the waltz became a distant, mournful drone. The laughter of the guests faded to a meaningless buzz. All she could see was Alistair's hand moving against the dark wood. It was not a random touch. It was a sequence. His thumb pressed firmly on the center of a carved oak leaf just below the third shelf. She saw the faint indentation, the way the muscle in his thumb tightened. Then his finger slid down, tracing the path of a carved vine. It was a fluid, deliberate motion, not a nervous scratch. The vine curled downwards and to the left, ending in a cluster of wooden grapes. His index finger stopped and tapped twice on the topmost grape. A quick, sharp double tap. From there, his hand moved across to a small, carved rose blooming at the edge of the panel. He pressed the very center of the rose, holding it for a second. 1, 2, 3. She counted the beats of her own frantic heart. Then he let go. Leaf, vine, grape, rustic, press, slide, tap, tap, press and hold. It was a pattern, a complex, specific pattern. It was not a habit, it was a mechanism. A cold electric shock jolted through her. The air left her lungs in a silent gasp. This was it. This was the key. For months she had searched for a physical key, a hidden lever, a misplaced book. She had been looking for an object. But the key was not an object. It was a sequence of movements, a code hidden in plain sight, disguised as a nervous tic. A code so familiar to Alistair that he performed it under duress without even realizing what he was doing. It was his father's legacy, burned into his muscle memory. Lord Harrington was still shouting something about legacy and shame. Alistair finally shoved himself off the wall, his face a mask of cold fury. "The discussion is over, Uncle," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He turned on his heel and strode back into the heart of the ballroom, his public mask of command firmly back in place. But Eleanor was no longer watching him. Her eyes were fixed on the bookshelf, the intricate carvings seeming to pulse with a life of their own. She could feel the ghost of his movements on the wood. The pressure, the slide, the taps. It was all there. She had to get it down. She could not risk forgetting a single step. The order, the timing, it all mattered. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs. The success of her entire life's mission, the restoration of her father's name, rested on her ability to remember 4 simple movements. She felt a wave of dizziness. The heat and noise of the room were suddenly suffocating. She had to get away. Now she turned to Anna, who was watching her with concerned eyes. "I am feeling unwell," Eleanor said, her voice a strained whisper. She hoped she looked as pale as she felt. "The heat, I need some air." Anna nodded instantly, her loyalty absolute. "Of course, Your Grace. Shall I accompany you?" "No," Eleanor said, forcing a calm she did not feel. "I just need a moment alone. Please make my apologies if I am missed." She moved with the same measured grace she had maintained all evening, though every instinct screamed at her to run. She drifted through an archway, away from the grand ballroom and into a quieter corridor lined with portraits of dead Blackwoods. Their painted eyes followed her, their expressions stern and judgmental. Tonight she did not care. She felt a surge of triumphant power that made her want to laugh in their silent, disapproving faces. "You hit it well," she thought, a silent message to the portrait of the old Duke, Theron Blackwood. But not well enough. She found what she was looking for, a small, unoccupied sitting room. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the furniture. The room was empty. On a small writing desk near the window lay discarded dance cards and a small inkwell. It was perfect. Her hands were trembling so badly she could barely function. She pressed them against the cold wood of the desk to steady them. "Breathe, Eleanor, breathe." She grabbed a blank card, the thick paper a comfort in her shaking grasp. She fumbled for the quill, dipping it into the ink. She had to get it right. She closed her eyes, picturing the bookshelf, picturing Alistair's hand. The image was seared into her mind, a brand of victory. First, the carving of the bookcase itself. She sketched a rough rectangle, then the lines of the shelves. Her artistic skill was passable, but tonight it felt clumsy, inadequate for the task. She drew the winding vine, the cluster of grapes, the proud oak leaf, the single rose. Then, with the image secure on the paper, she began to trace the path. A small X on the leaf, a dotted line following the curve of the vine, 2 dots on the grape, a heavier circle in the center of the rose. She even wrote the actions next to them, her script ragged with haste. Press, slide, tap twice, press and hold. She stared down at the small piece of cardstock. It was a crude, frantic drawing, a meaningless series of lines and marks to anyone else. But to her, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was the key to a locked room. It was the map to a hidden truth. It was the weapon she would use to reclaim her father's honor. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic, glorious rhythm of hope and terror. She had it. She finally had it. She carefully folded the small card, the ink still slightly damp, and tucked it into the bodice of her gown. It rested there, a secret promise against her skin. She excused herself from the ball, retreating not to the gardens for air, but to a quiet, shadowed alcove down the hall. Leaning against the cool stone out of sight, she pulled out the scrap of paper, needing to look at it one more time to be sure it was real. The news arrived with the Morning Post, carried on a silver tray. Alistair read the letter over breakfast, his brow furrowed. The silence in the cavernous dining room was broken only by the clink of silverware against porcelain. Eleanor watched him over the rim of her teacup. She held it with both hands, a habit she had developed to stop them from shaking. He folded the letter with a sharp crease. "I am called to London," he announced, his voice devoid of any real emotion. "An urgent matter with the ducal investments. I will be gone for several days." Eleanor's heart gave a single, violent thud against her ribs. This was it, the opportunity, the one she had prayed for, the one she had dreaded. She had to force the air from her lungs before she could speak. Her voice, when it came, was a perfect imitation of a dutiful wife's. "Will you be traveling long, Your Grace?" "3 days, 4 at the most." He looked at her then, his piercing blue eyes seeming to search her face for something. A reaction, perhaps. Disappointment. Relief. She gave him nothing but serene stillness. The mask she had perfected over months of torment was now her strongest armor. He seemed vaguely dissatisfied with her composure. "The household will continue as normal. I trust you will manage things in my absence." Well, it was not a question. It was a command wrapped in the thinnest veil of courtesy. "Of course," she said, her gaze steady, "I will ensure everything is in order for your return." He left an hour later. Eleanor stood at the grand entrance, the picture of a concerned duchess, as his carriage rumbled down the long gravel drive. She watched until it was just a black speck against the gray morning sky. Only when it disappeared completely did she allow her shoulders to slump. Just for a moment. The weight of what she was about to do settled upon her. The house suddenly felt enormous, empty, and full of watching eyes, even with its master gone. She spent the day in a haze of forced normalcy. She consulted with the housekeeper about menus she did not care about. She walked in the gardens, the damp autumn air chilling her skin, the faded sketch of the carved pattern burning a hole in her pocket. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall was a drumbeat counting down to the night. Doubt, a cold and creeping vine, began to wrap around her resolve. What if she was wrong? What if the pattern was just a meaningless flourish, a figment of her desperate imagination? What if she were caught? That evening, Anna came to her chambers to help her dress for a solitary dinner. The young maid's hands were gentle as she brushed Eleanor's hair. The room was quiet, lit only by the soft glow of a few lamps. "He is gone, my lady," Anna whispered, her voice barely audible. Her eyes, reflected in the mirror, were wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. Eleanor met her gaze in the glass. "Yes, Anna, he is gone." "Tonight, then?" Eleanor nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She felt the worn leather of her father's journal, which she kept hidden in her dressing table drawer, like a silent accusation. She was risking everything on a ghost's gesture and a daughter's faith. Anna's hand stilled on her shoulder. "Your father would be proud of your courage, Eleanor." The use of her first name, a familiarity reserved for these private, stolen moments, almost broke her. A single tear escaped and traced a cold path down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away. "Courage feels a lot like terror, Anna." "They are often the same thing," the maid replied softly. "One just has a better reason." Later, the silence of Blackwood Manor was a living thing. The servants had retired to their quarters. The fires in the great hearths had been banked, leaving behind the faint, pleasant smell of wood smoke and ash. Moonlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters on the marble floors. Eleanor waited in her room until the clock downstairs chimed midnight. Each chime was a hammer blow to her nerves. She wore a simple, dark dress, her feet shod in soft slippers that made no sound. In her hand, she clutched the small, folded paper with the pattern she had sketched. It was damp from the sweat of her palm. She slipped out of her room, a ghost in a house of ghosts. The corridor was a tunnel of darkness, punctuated by silver pools of moonlight. Every creak of the old house's timbers made her freeze, her heart leaping into her throat. She imagined Alistair returning early, finding her, his cold fury turning into something far worse. She reached the library. The massive double doors were closed but unlocked, just as they had been since she had helped him with the land treaty. She paused, her hand hovering over the cold brass handle. This was the point of no return. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and old paper, and pushed the door open. It swung inward with a low, mournful groan that seemed to echo in the vast, silent space. The library was even more intimidating at night. The endless rows of books were dark spines in the gloom, a silent army guarding the Blackwood legacy. She did not light a lamp, relying instead on the moonlight that generously filled the two-story chamber. She moved toward the far wall, her slippers whispering over the polished floor. Her destination was the ornate bookshelf she had watched so many times, the one Alistair touched without thinking. Her fingers trembled as she reached out to the carved wooden panel. It was a complex design of interwoven vines and leaves, cool and smooth under her touch. She unfolded the scrap of paper, her eyes straining to see the sequence of lines she had drawn. Her mind felt foggy with fear. For a terrifying second, she couldn't remember where to start. She closed her eyes, picturing Alistair at the ball, his hand moving over the wood. Right, then left, a downward curve, then a sharp press on a particular wooden knot. Her breath hitched. She began to trace the pattern. Her finger moved from one point to another, pressing where he had pressed, sliding where he had slid. The wood felt inert, lifeless. Nothing happened. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her. She had been wrong. It was all for nothing. She had built a fantasy from a nervous habit. She sagged against the bookshelf, the last of her hope draining away. She had failed her father. She had bound herself to this monstrous family for nothing. And then, her hand, resting against the panel in defeat, brushed against a small, almost invisible indentation she hadn't noticed before. The final point in the sequence. It wasn't a press, but a push. With a surge of desperate adrenaline, she pushed it. There was a low, satisfying click. It was not loud, but in the profound silence, it sounded like a gunshot. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing else occurred. Then, with a soft grinding of hidden mechanisms, the entire section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow opening. A wave of musty, stale air washed over her, the smell of a room that had not breathed for years. It was the scent of sealed secrets. Peering into the blackness, she could just make out the shape of a room beyond, the old Duke's secret study. It was real. Her hands were shaking so badly now that she could barely function. She fumbled in her pocket for the small box of matches Anna had given her. Her first attempt failed, the matchstick snapping between her trembling fingers. The second try succeeded. A tiny flame bloomed in the darkness, and she used it to light a small candle she had brought. Holding the candle aloft, she stepped across the threshold. The room was small and airless, dominated by a single massive oak desk. Dust lay thick on every surface, a gray shroud covering the past. A tall, stiff-backed chair was tucked neatly under the desk, as if its occupant had just stood up and would be back at any moment. The walls were lined not with books, but with grim, leather-bound ledgers, each marked with a year. Her eyes scanned the room, but she knew what she was looking for. It was not on the shelves, it was on the desk, placed squarely in the center as if it were an altar, a massive, iron-clasped ledger, far larger than the others. Its dark leather cover was almost black with age. It had no year marked on its spine. It was simply the ledger. She approached the desk, her light casting dancing shadows around her. Her reflection stared back from the polished, dusty surface of the wood, a pale, wide-eyed woman on the verge of either triumph or collapse. She set the candle down carefully. The air was so still that the flame barely flickered. With a reverence born of long-nurtured hatred and grief, she reached out and placed her hands on the book. The leather was cold and stiff. The iron clasp was heavy and ornate, a final lock on a generation of lies. It took both her hands and all her strength to lift the rusty latch. It opened with a sharp, grating screech. She lifted the heavy cover. The first page was a litany of numbers, a column of transactions in the late Duke Theron's sharp, aggressive handwriting. Shipping dates, cargo weights, payments received. It all looked official, impenetrable. She flipped through the pages, her hope beginning to falter again. It was just a book of accounts, meticulous, detailed, but telling her nothing she did not already know. This was the official record, the one that had ruined her father by showing fabricated debts and failed shipments under his name. Despair washed over her. Had she come all this way for nothing? Was the truth buried so deep that even this secret room would not yield it? She was about to close the book when her fingers brushed against the inside of the back cover. It felt wrong, too thick, a slight bulge near the spine. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She ran her fingertips over the spot again. There was a seam, expertly hidden in the leatherwork. Using her fingernail, she pried at the edge. A section of the cover lining came loose, revealing not cardboard, but a shallow, hidden compartment. And inside, tucked away from the world, was a small, thin booklet, a second set of accounts. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she lifted it out. This handwriting was the same, Theron Blackwood's unmistakable script, but the numbers were different. The notes scrawled in the margins were not about business. They were personal, cruel, and triumphant. She read a line, J. Vance shipment rerouted, assets absorbed. His trust is a remarkable weakness. Another entry, covered my own losses from the Eastern trade collapse. Julian will take the fall. He is too honorable to suspect a thing. The words blurred. The truth was here, cold, undeniable, and written in the hand of the man who had destroyed her world. It detailed every lie, every stolen shipment, every falsified debt. It laid bare the entire conspiracy, a meticulous record of a friend's calculated betrayal. Her father had not been a failure. He had been a sacrifice. A sound escaped her throat, a choked sob that was half grief and half vindication. The candle flame wavered as a tear fell onto the dusty desk beside the ledger. Then another. They streamed down her face, hot and silent. She did not weep for the girl who had lost her father. She wept for the honorable man who had died believing he had failed, his name disgraced. She clutched the secret booklet to her chest, the undeniable proof of his innocence, and sank into the old Duke's chair, finally broken by the victory she had fought so long to achieve. The tears that had blurred the damning script had dried, leaving stiff, salty tracks on Eleanor's cheeks. She did not wipe them away. They were part of this moment, a testament to the years of silent grief that had finally found their voice. Not in a scream, but in the scratch of a dead man's pen. For a long while, she simply sat in the dust, in the stale air of the secret study, her fingers resting on the open page. The truth was not a weight lifted. It was a weight transferred, a cold, heavy stone she now had to place in another's hands. Her father was innocent. The words repeated in her mind, a litany that was both a prayer and a war cry. He was innocent, and Duke Theron Blackwood was a thief and a liar. Slowly, deliberately, Eleanor rose. Her body felt strangely light, hollowed out by the force of the revelation. She looked around the small, suffocating room one last time. This was the tomb of her family's honor, a place of secrets and decay. It was time to bring its contents into the light. With careful, steady hands, she lifted the massive ledger from the desk. It was heavier than she expected. Its iron clasp cold against her skin. She did not close it. She would not hide the truth, not even for a moment. Carrying it before her like a sacred offering, she walked out of the secret study and back into the grand library. The click of the hidden door sealing shut behind her was a sound of finality. A chapter of hidden searching was over. A new one of open confrontation was about to begin. She did not return to her own rooms. Her chambers, with their soft fabrics and lonely stillness, were a place for Eleanor Vance. The woman who now walked through the silent, moonlit halls of Blackwood Manor was the Duchess, and her place was at the center of power. She went directly to Alistair's personal study. The room was his sanctuary, the heart of his authority, filled with the scent of his cologne, of old books, and of an unshakable, inherited pride. It was a pride built on a lie, and she was here to tear it down. She placed the ledger on the center of his large mahogany desk, the very desk from which he managed the fortune his father had stolen. She opened it carefully to the correct page, the fraudulent entries beside the hidden true account. The two columns were a silent accusation. Then she sat in the high-backed leather chair opposite the desk. Not his chair, never his, but a seat of judgment, a witness waiting for the accused to arrive. She had prepared herself to wait for days. Anna had confirmed that Alistair was not expected back from London until the end of the week. The time would have been a torment, a slow burn of anticipation and fear. But fate, it seemed, had grown impatient. Just as the first pale light of dawn began to touch the tall arched windows, a distant sound broke the manor's slumber. The crunch of carriage wheels on the gravel drive, a stable boy's surprised shout, the deep, familiar echo of the great oak front door opening and closing. Her breath caught in her throat. Her heart, which had been beating with a slow, resolute rhythm, began to hammer against her ribs. He was back, a day early. The timeline had collapsed, and the confrontation was no longer a distant storm. It was here. Eleanor heard his footsteps on the marble floor of the grand hall. They were heavy, tired, and annoyed. She knew his walk, the confident, impatient stride of a man who owned the very ground beneath his feet. She heard him exchange a few curt words with the butler, his voice a low rumble of displeasure. Probably about the early return, the disruption to his plans. Her hands resting in her lap clenched into fists, the fabric of her dress wrinkled under the pressure. This was it, the culmination of her marriage, of her sacrifice, of her entire life since her father's fall. The doorknob turned. Alistair entered his study, shrugging off his travel coat. He stopped dead just inside the doorway. His eyes, clouded with weariness from the road, sharpened instantly, fixing on her. He saw her first, a still, pale figure in the dim morning light, an unwelcome specter in his private domain. His face darkened with anger. "What are you doing in here?" His voice was cold, sharp, and utterly commanding. It was the voice he had used on their wedding night, the voice of a master to a possession. But the woman he was speaking to was not the same one who had trembled under his threat. She had held the truth in her hands. She had cried the last of her helpless tears. Eleanor did not answer. She did not need to. Her silence was more powerful than any words she could have spoken. Her eyes, holding his, were not filled with defiance or triumph. They were filled with a deep, profound, and devastating sorrow. It was a sorrow that was not just for her own loss, but for his as well, though he did not yet know it. She looked at him, this man whose entire world was a carefully constructed lie, and felt a flicker of something akin to pity. Then with a slow, graceful movement, she lifted a hand and gestured toward the desk, toward the open ledger. Her gaze never left his face, watching as his eyes followed her direction. He saw the book then. His expression shifted from anger to irritated suspicion. "More theatrics, Eleanor. Did you spend your lonely nights composing a play for my return?" He strode into the room, his arrogance a shield around him. He did not believe for a second that she could have found anything of substance. To him, she was still the desperate daughter of a traitor, grasping at straws. He intended to walk to the desk, slam the book shut, and put her firmly back in her place. He would remind her that his study was forbidden, that her place was to be silent and decorative. He reached the desk, his lip curled in a dismissive sneer. He glanced down at the open page, ready to laugh at whatever pathetic fabrications she had concocted. But the laugh never came. He scoffed, a short, sharp sound of contempt, ready to dismiss it all. His eyes, however, did not see the columns of numbers first. They caught on the familiar, aggressive slant of the handwriting in the margins, the sharp, decisive cross of a T, the slightly ostentatious loop of a B in the Blackwood name. It was his father's script. He knew it as well as he knew his own face in the mirror. It was the hand that had signed his school reports, that had written him letters, that had shaped the very foundation of his life. And it was there, right next to a set of figures that were demonstrably, impossibly false. A cold dread, sudden and sickening, began to creep into his heart, silencing the scorn in his throat and freezing the blood in his veins. The scoff died in Alistair's throat, strangled by a wave of cold dread. It was his father's hand, unmistakable. The sharp, aggressive slant of the letters, the precise, impatient way he formed his numbers. He had seen that script on birthday cards, on ducal decrees, on notes of paternal advice. Now he saw it here in this hidden book, cataloging a crime. His hand, as if with a will of its own, reached out and touched the page. The paper was dry and old. The ink was faded. It was real. His heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against his ribs, a funeral march for a truth he had not yet accepted. He forced his eyes to move, to read the entries that Eleanor had so carefully revealed. A shipment of timber from the Vance estates, recorded as spoiled and worthless in the public ledger, was noted here as sold at a triple profit to a buyer in the north. A debt forgiven to a minor lord was secretly collected, with the funds diverted to a personal account Alistair had never known existed. Line after damning line, date after sickening date. He saw the story of his father's friendship with Lord Vance unwind into a calculated, methodical demolition. Each entry was a stone removed from the foundation of Alistair's world. The man he had revered, the titan of industry and honor whose legacy he struggled to uphold, was a phantom. The real man was here, in this secret ink. A cold sweat slicked his brow. The room, once a sanctuary of power, felt like a tomb. Suddenly, a violent, desperate rage surged through him, a final defense against the encroaching reality. He slammed the heavy ledger shut. The sound cracked through the silence of the study like a gunshot. "Forgery," he snarled, the word tearing from his throat. He rounded the desk, his towering frame casting a long, menacing shadow over Eleanor. "This is a pathetic, desperate lie." His blue eyes, usually so cold and controlled, were wild with a cornered animal's fury. He grabbed the book, his knuckles white, wanting to hurl it into the fire to burn the lie away. But he couldn't. It felt too heavy, too true. He threw it back onto the desk instead. "You did this," he accused, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. He advanced on her, forcing her to take a step back until her shoulders met the cold, unyielding wood of a bookshelf. "You came into my home, my life, and you planted this poison. You, the daughter of a traitor, trying to stain a good man's name to salvage your own." He was shouting now, the sound raw with pain and disbelief. "Did you spend your nights copying my father's hand? Did you conspire with your servants to create this elaborate fiction?" He braced his hands on the shelf on either side of her head, trapping her. His face was inches from hers, his breath hot with anger. He wanted her to crumble. He needed her to be the liar, the villain. It was the only way his world could remain intact. Eleanor did not flinch. She did not look away. She simply held his gaze, her own gray eyes filled not with fear, but with a profound and weary sorrow. She had prepared for this storm. She had lived it in her imagination 1,000 times. His rage was just the death throe of a lie she had sworn to kill. She let him exhaust his accusations, let the echoes of his fury fade into the oppressive quiet. She could smell the scent of old leather from his jacket, see the fine tremor in his clenched jaw. She saw the little boy who had worshipped his father, now lost inside the enraged man. When he finally fell silent, panting slightly, his chest heaving, she spoke. Her voice was not a whisper, but it was low, clear, and absolutely steady. It cut through the tension like glass. "I did not write a single word in that book." She paused, letting the simple truth settle in the space between them. "Your father did." Alistair opened his mouth to retort, to unleash another torrent of denial, but she continued, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Look at the dates, Alistair. Your father was a brilliant man, a meticulous record keeper. He documented everything." Her eyes never left his. "Go to the archive. Find the shipping manifests from that year. The real ones, not the copies he filed for public view. Cross-reference them with the accounts in that ledger." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Every word was a carefully aimed blow against the cracked walls of his denial. "You will find the corresponding payment records. You will see the ships he chartered under a different company name. You will find the proof that the timber he claimed was rotten arrived in perfect condition and made him a fortune." She took a small, deliberate breath. "He was a brilliant man," she repeated, And this time the words carried the full weight of her family's ruin. He was also a thief. The final word hung in the air. It was not an insult. It was a diagnosis, a fact. Alistair stared at her, the rage draining from his face, replaced by a ghastly dawning horror. Her logic was a cold, clean blade, slicing through the tangled mess of his emotions. She was not just accusing. She was giving him instructions. She was telling him exactly how to prove her right. She was certain of what he would find. And in her certainty, he found only despair. The strength went out of his arms, and his hands fell from the bookshelf to his sides. He stumbled back a step, then another, his gaze dropping from her face to the monstrous ledger sitting on his father's desk. That book, that object was no longer a collection of lies. It was a testament, a confession written by the hand of the man he had spent his entire life trying to emulate. The fury that had sustained him moments before was gone, burned out, leaving behind a chilling emptiness. There was nothing left to fight. The enemy was not Eleanor. The enemy was his own blood, his own name, his own history. The truth was in his house, in his archive, in his father's own script. He was the duke of a house built on fraud, the son of a man who destroyed his closest friend for profit. He backed away until the back of his legs hit the heavy leather of the duke's chair. His father's chair, with a shuddering breath that sounded like a saw, he collapsed into it. He did not look at Eleanor. He could not. He just stared at the closed ledger, the iron clasp like a seal on his family's tomb. The anger was gone, replaced by a horrifying, hollow silence that filled his ears, his chest, his entire being. He was the Duke of Blackwood, and he was utterly, completely broken. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. It filled the study, pressing down on them both thick with the dust of old lies. Alistair sat folded in his chair, a man made of stone, his gaze fixed on the open ledger. His world had been reduced to 2 pages of elegant, damning script. Eleanor watched him, the architect of his ruin. Her heart should have been singing with triumph. She had done it. She had brought the Titan of House Blackwood to his knees without raising her voice. But there was no song. There was only the quiet rasp of his breathing and the scent of beeswax and betrayal. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times. In her dreams, it was fire and righteous fury. In reality, it was just this, a hollow, broken man in a quiet, empty room. Without a word, she turned and walked out, leaving the door ajar. She did not look back. For a full day and the night that followed, the manor held its breath. Servants whispered in hallways, their voices hushed, their eyes darting towards the sealed library doors. Eleanor took her meals in her room, listening to the silence. Anna would bring her tea, her face a mask of worried loyalty. She reported that the Duke had locked himself in the archives. He had ordered that no one, under any circumstances, was to disturb him. He had taken no food, no water, only the ledger. Eleanor would nod, her own appetite gone. She spent the hours sitting by the window, her father's journal resting unread in her lap. The victory she had sought for so long had arrived, but it felt like a ghost, cold and unwelcome. She had planned her war meticulously. She had prepared for his anger, his denial, his threats. She had never prepared for his complete and utter disintegration. Inside the archives, time had ceased to exist. Alistair was a man possessed, moving through the cold, airless space like a phantom. The grand ledger lay open on a central table under the light of a single harsh lamp. Around it, he built a chaotic fortress of paper. He pulled down shipping manifests from 2 decades prior, their pages brittle and smelling of salt and decay. He unsealed boxes of bank drafts and correspondence. The ink faded, but the numbers terrifyingly clear. His hands, usually so steady, trembled as he laid them out, cross-referencing dates, cargo weights, and payment accounts. At first, he was searching for the flaw, the single mistake in her forgery that would prove his father's honor. He was the Duke. His father was the great Theron Blackwood, the man who had built an empire. This woman, this Vance, was a liar. She had to be. But there was no flaw. With every document he unfurled, the truth coiled tighter around his throat. He saw the discrepancies. A shipment of grain logged in his father's private ledger as sold for one price, but the official bank deposit showed a figure 10% lower. The difference was a series of payments made to an account he didn't recognize. An account that, after hours of frantic searching, he found linked to the Port Authority official who had condemned Lord Vance's ships. He found letters from his father to his bankers, instructing them to acquire Vance's shipping asset at a fraction of their value, dated weeks before the public scandal even broke. It was premeditated, cold, vicious. He saw the systematic dismantling of an honorable man's life, orchestrated by the person he had admired above all others. The image of his father, immortalized in the grand portrait in the main hall, began to change in his mind. The stern, confident gaze became the shrewd stare of a predator. The firm set of his jaw was not strength, but cruel, unbending avarice. Every memory of his father's lectures on honor, on the Blackwood name, became a sickening charade. The man hadn't been a lion. He had been a jackal, dressing in a lion's skin. Alistair sank to the floor, leaning his head against a dusty shelf, the papers scattered around him like fallen leaves. He was not the son of a great man. He was the son of a thief, the heir to a fortune built on the rubble of another man's life. The hollow silence he had felt in the study was now a cavern inside him, an emptiness where his pride and his identity used to be. He finally understood the sorrow in Eleanor's eyes. It was not the grief of a trader's daughter. It was the grief of an orphan whose father had been murdered by his. He emerged from the library late the next afternoon. The staff who saw him averted their eyes, startled by his appearance. His tailored suit was creased and dusted with grime. His dark hair was disheveled, and a dark stubble shadowed his jaw. But the most profound change was in his eyes. The piercing, arrogant blue had been replaced by a dull, haunted emptiness. He looked older and infinitely more tired. He did not go to his study or his chambers. He walked through the silent house and out into the gardens, his steps slow and unsteady. He needed air. He needed to escape the suffocating weight of his own name. He found her near the rose bushes, her back to him. She was carefully pruning dead leaves from a white rose, her movements precise and calm. She wore a simple gray dress, her auburn hair tied back, and for a moment she looked less like a duchess and more like a simple country girl. As if she could feel his presence, she stopped, her hand hovering over a bloom. She did not turn around immediately. She stood perfectly still, a pair of garden shears held loosely in her gloved hand. He watched the slender line of her back, the slight tension in her shoulders. This was the woman whose life his family had shattered, the woman he had threatened and scorned on their wedding day, the woman who had endured his contempt with a quiet, unbreakable dignity. He took a few steps forward onto the soft grass, his boots making no sound. He stopped a few feet behind her. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. The commanding voice of the Duke was gone, replaced by the hesitant rasp of a broken man. "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without a title. She turned slowly. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. Her gray eyes met his, and for the first time, he did not see defiance or sorrow. He saw only a deep, profound stillness, as if she were the calm at the center of his storm. She saw the truth in his face. She saw the surrender. He didn't have to show her the papers. He was wearing his defeat like a shroud. He swallowed, forcing the words out. They felt like shards of glass in his throat. "My father," he began, his voice cracking. He had to stop, take a breath, and start again. "He destroyed your family." He looked away from her, toward the distant woods, unable to bear the quiet intensity of her gaze. The ledgers, the manifests. He destroyed an honorable man. His own words condemned him, condemned his entire existence. He finally looked back at her, his eyes pleading, stripped of all pride. "I am sorry." The last word was barely a whisper, yet it echoed in the space between them with the force of a thunderclap. It was an apology for his father, for his own ignorance, for his cruelty, for a lifetime of stolen honor. Eleanor looked at the humbled Duke, the man she had married to destroy. Her victory was complete. He had admitted everything. The war was won. But as she looked at his shattered face, she felt no triumph. There was no elation, no satisfaction. There was only a sudden sharp ache in her chest. She saw not the arrogant tyrant who had taunted her, but a man who had just lost his father for a second time. A man discovering that his entire life was founded on a crime. In that moment, watching the son mourn the myth of the father who had ruined hers, she felt not the isolating glory of revenge, but a pang of shared, profound loss. Eleanor looked at the humble duke, the man she married to destroy, and felt not triumph, but a pang of shared, profound loss. The cold garden air settled around them, carrying the scent of damp earth. She had imagined this moment for months, picturing herself standing over him, the truth in her hand like a sharpened blade. She had expected righteous fire, a cleansing wave of vindication. But the man before her was not the arrogant tyrant from her imagination. He was just a man, his pride stripped away, his world shattered by the sins of his father. The victory felt hollow, and the silence was filled with the quiet grief of two families broken by the same lie. Alistair finally raised his head. His piercing blue eyes, once so full of a command, were now filled with a deep, hollowed-out emptiness. The weight of his father's betrayal had settled on his broad shoulders, and for the first time he looked breakable. His voice, when it came, was raw and quiet, stripped of all its ducal authority. "What do you want, Eleanor?" The question was simple, but it contained the weight of a lifetime. He was offering restitution, expecting her to demand his ruin. He braced himself for a demand of gold, of land, of a quiet annulment that would leave him disgraced. Eleanor held his gaze. Her heart, a tight, cold knot in her chest for years, seemed to loosen. She could destroy him. With a few words, she could demand a price that would cripple the Blackwood estate for a generation. The thought was a bitter whisper of the girl she used to be, the one who dreamed only of revenge. But her father's face rose in her memory, a scholar who valued his honor above all fortunes. Her revenge was never about money, it was about truth. Her own voice was steady. "I want my father's name cleared," she said, each word precise. "Publicly." Alistair's eyes widened. Of all the things he had expected, this was the most devastating. A financial settlement could be hidden. An annulment could be explained away. But a public declaration meant admitting to the world that his family's modern fortune was built on a crime. It meant tearing down the statue of his father and confessing he was a thief. It was a price far higher than gold. For a long moment he did not speak. He simply looked at her, at the woman who had methodically dismantled his entire world. He saw the resolve in her sorrowful eyes and understood. This was not a negotiation. It was a sentence. He gave a single sharp nod. "It will be done." The words were a vow, his penance. Without another word, they turned and walked back toward the silent manor. The great house no longer felt like her prison or his fortress. It felt like a shared inheritance of secrets and sorrow. Alistair led her not to their separate chambers, but to the library. The air inside smelled of old paper and beeswax. A fire had been lit, casting a warm, flickering glow over the towering shelves. The infamous ledger still sat on his desk, a dark monument to the truth they now both shared. He stood before the hearth, staring into the flames, a man adrift in the wreckage of his life. Eleanor watched him. The hatred she had nurtured for so long now burned out, leaving a strange and unsettling empathy. He turned from the fire, his face vulnerable in the flickering light. Slowly he took a step toward her. He did not speak. He simply raised his hand, palm open, in a silent, uncertain offering. It was a gesture so unlike the confident, possessive man she had married. This was not a command, it was a question. Eleanor looked down at his outstretched hand. She remembered the day of their wedding, his fingers closing around her arm like a manacle. This was different. Her own hand felt impossibly heavy as she lifted it. Her fingers trembled as she placed her hand in his. His skin was warm. He closed his fingers around hers, his grip gentle, almost reverent. It was the first time they had ever truly touched. The contact sent a shock through her, not of fear, but of a startling, unexpected warmth that spread from her hand and all the way to the frozen core of her heart. Alistair held her hand, feeling the delicate bones beneath his fingers. He looked from their joined hands to her face, finally seeing her clearly. His father's legacy was an illusion, but this woman, the one he had tried to break, was real. Her grief was real. Her strength was real. He realized with a humbling clarity that she was the strongest person he had ever met. The war was over. The need for revenge was gone, replaced by a truth that had paradoxically set them both free. And there, in the quiet of the library, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, something new and fragile had just begun to grow.